I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and I am the invisible architect who wrote the source code for the multi-billion-dollar empire my husband is currently trying to steal from me. The air in the courtroom tasted like stale coffee and old wood polish. It was a suffocating, heavy smell that coated the back of my throat. I sat alone at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned the color of bone. Across the aisle, the atmosphere was entirely different. Felt like a cocktail party. Julian sat there. My husband. The man I had promised my life to. He was leaning back in his leather chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, whispering something to the silver-haired shark he had hired as his lead counsel. They both chuckled. That sound, that low, dismissive laughter, hit me harder than a physical blow. It vibrated through the floorboards and traveled straight up my spine. He looked impeccable. He was wearing the navy bespoke suit I had picked out for him for the cover of Forbes last month. His hair was perfectly coiffed. He looked like the visionary the world thought he was. But I knew the truth. I looked at his hands, currently toying with a gold fountain pen, and I remembered when those hands were shaking too hard to type. I remembered the garage in Palo Alto. I could almost smell the burning solder and the mildew of that cramped space. I remembered the nights we stayed up until 4 a.m., eating instant noodles because we couldn't afford real food. I remembered Julian crying on the floor in 2016 when the beta launch failed, sobbing that he was a failure, that he was going to ruin us. I was the one who knelt beside him. I was the one who wiped his face. And more importantly, I was the one who got up, sat at the computer, and rewrote the entire back-end architecture in 48 hours straight without sleep. Fixed the bugs. I streamlined the algorithm. I built the engine that drove the car he was now driving away in. Your Honor, Julian's lawyer boomed, standing up and buttoning his jacket with an air of arrogance that sucked the oxygen out of the room. The plaintiff's demands are frankly insulting. Ms. Vance is requesting a 50% stake in Vance Tech, claiming intellectual property contributions. This is a fantasy. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to catch Julian's eye, but he wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the ceiling, looking bored. The reality, the lawyer continued, pacing in front of the judge, is that Ms. Vance was a supportive spouse. She managed the household. She hosted the dinner parties. She ensured Mr. Vance was comfortable so he could do the genius work required to build a unicorn company. We do not deny she was a good wife. But to claim she is a co-founder, to claim she wrote the code. He paused for dramatic effect, turning to look at me with a pitying smile. She doesn't even have a computer science degree, Your Honor. She was an art history major. The idea that she understands the complexities of neural network processing is, well, it's charming, but it's untrue. I felt the heat rising up my neck, a burning flush of humiliation. It was true I didn't have the degree. I dropped out of my program to work 2 retail jobs so Julian could focus on the startup. I taught myself Python, C++, and Swift at night while he slept. I learned by doing. I learned by building his dream. I object, my lawyer squeaked. He was a court-appointed representative because Julian had frozen all our joint accounts the morning he filed for divorce. I had zero access to the millions I had helped earn. My lawyer was young, overworked, and clearly terrified of Julian's legal team. Mrs. Vance has intimate knowledge of the company's founding. Julian's lawyer laughed again. Intimate knowledge. Did she overhear phone calls? Did she bring coffee to the developers? Absolutely. But let's be clear. Julian Vance is the mind. Octavia Vance was the mascot. The mascot. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Julian finally looked at me then. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with me. There was no remorse in his gaze. There was no love. There was only the cold, calculating look of a man who had decided I was a liability he needed to liquidate. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. It was a gesture that said, "You did this to yourself." Felt sick. Physically nauseous. They were rewriting my entire life in real time. They were taking 10 years of my blood, sweat, and sacrifice and reducing it to bringing coffee. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap over the table and rattle off the encryption keys to the server that only I knew. I wanted to shout about the hidden backdoors in the code that I had installed for security. Backdoors Julian didn't even know existed. But I sat frozen. The power dynamic was so overwhelmingly against me. I was the art dropout. He was the tech titan. Who would the judge believe? "We have prepared a settlement," Julian's lawyer said, sliding a thin folder across the table toward me. "It is generous, considering the circumstances. A monthly stipend for 2 years. And a small apartment in the city. In exchange, Ms. Vance signs a permanent NDA and relinquishes all claims to the company." It was a crumb. A scrap thrown to a beggar. I looked at the folder. I looked at Julian. He was checking his watch. He thought this was over. He thought he had crushed me. "I won't sign it," I whispered. My voice was shaky, but it was there. "Speak up, Ms. Vance," the judge said, looking over his spectacles with impatience. "I said I won't sign it," I said louder this time. "I built that company. I wrote the code for the Phoenix project. I designed the interface." Julian laughed out loud this time. "Octavia, stop. You're embarrassing yourself. You can barely use an iPhone." The courtroom tittered. The humiliation was total. Felt small. Felt erased. I looked at the heavy double doors at the back of the room, wishing I could just disappear, wishing I had never met him. I was entirely alone in this fight. Or so I thought. Just as the judge raised his gavel to possibly rule on the motion to dismiss my claims, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom groaned. They swung open with a force that made everyone turn around. The rhythm of heels clicking against the marble floor cut through the silence. Asterisk click. 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 Asterisk. Turn. My breath caught in my throat. Standing there, framed by the light of the hallway, was a woman the world hadn't seen in 20 years. She was wearing a white suit that cost more than my lawyer's annual salary. Her hair was iron gray and cut in a sharp bob. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a cane in the other, though she didn't seem to need it. It was my mother, but not the mother Julian knew. He knew her as the quiet woman who knitted blankets in a retirement home in Florida. He knew her as Nana. He didn't know who she was before. He didn't know that before she retired to obscurity, she was the most feared corporate litigator on the East Coast. He didn't know she had buried companies bigger than his for breakfast. She stopped in the center of the aisle. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at Julian. And for the first time all morning, the smirk fell off his face. "I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and the man I built a multi-billion-dollar empire for is currently trying to erase my existence with a PowerPoint presentation." The heavy silence that had followed my mother's entrance didn't last long. It hung in the air for a moment, thick and electric, before Julian's lawyer, a man named Sterling who wore cologne that smelled like burning pine, decided to shatter it. He wasn't going to let an old woman with a cane derail his kill shot. He glanced at my mother, who had taken a seat in the front row of the gallery with the poise of a queen claiming her throne, and then he sneered. He turned his back on her. He turned his attention to the judge. And then he turned the projector on. The hum of the machine fan sounded like a chainsaw in the quiet courtroom. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a register of mock sorrow. "We have established that Mrs. Vance was not a coder. But unfortunately, her lack of professional contribution is not the only issue at hand. We must address where the company's early capital actually went." A beam of harsh white light hit the wall to my left. I flinched as if I'd been slapped. The first image appeared. It was a photo of me. I was walking out of a high-end boutique in Milan, my arms laden with shopping bags, laughing with my head thrown back. I stared at the photo, my stomach dropping through the floor. I remembered that day. It was 3 years ago. I wasn't shopping for myself. I was buying gift bags for the investors Julian was trying to woo at the European Tech Summit. I had spent 4 hours curating personalized gifts to ensure they signed the Series B funding. I was laughing because I was exhausted, delirious from jet lag, and on the phone with my sister. "Exhibit A," Sterling narrated, pacing in front of the image. While Mr. Vance was in the hotel room coding the patch for the security breach, Mrs. Vance was on a spree. $50,000 in one afternoon. Billed to the company card as client relations. "That's a lie," I whispered. My voice sounded thin, brittle. "Those were for the investors." "Silence from the plaintiff," the judge snapped. Her eyes, previously neutral, were now cold. She looked from the photo to me, and I saw the judgment settling in her gaze. She saw a spoiled wife spending her husband's hard-earned money. The slide clicked. Another photo. Me on a yacht, holding a glass of champagne, wearing a bikini. "Exhibit B," Sterling continued. "The corporate retreat. In Cabo. Mr. Vance was not present. He was in San Francisco, handling the server migration. Mrs. Vance, however, chartered this vessel using the company's emergency operational fund. My hands started to tremble. The shaking started in my fingertips and traveled up my arms until my shoulders were vibrating. I looked at Julian. He was watching the screen, a small, sad smile on his face, as if it pained him to reveal my true nature. That yacht trip. It was a networking event for the wives of the Silicon Valley elite. Julian had begged me to go. He told me I needed to schmooze the spouses to secure social standing for our brand. I hated boats. I didn't drink the champagne. I held it for the photo because Julian texted me. * make it look like we made it, Octavia. Sell the lifestyle. * I was selling his lie. And now he was using the marketing material as a weapon against me. "She wasn't building the company, Your Honor," Sterling said, leaning on the podium. "She was bleeding it dry." Then came the bank statements. They were blown up to 5 feet tall, red circles drawn around every withdrawal I had made. The numbers were staggering, but they were all out of context. Withdrawal, $15,000 cash. For drugs, Sterling posited, letting the question hang in the air.
Well,
For the freelance developers we hired off the books because we couldn't afford payroll taxes yet. I paid them in cash at a diner at 2 a.m. so the site wouldn't crash. Withdrawal, $8,000. Tiffany & Company. Jewelry, Sterling asked.
well,
Watches for the groomsmen at his brother's wedding, which he forgot to buy until the morning of, and begged me to handle. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a frantic, irregular rhythm, like a bird throwing itself against a cage. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt constricted by an iron band. Every accusation was a twisted version of my loyalty. Every crime was just another sacrifice I had made for him. I looked at the gallery. My mother sat motionless. Her hands were resting on the head of her cane. Her face was unreadable, a mask of stone. But her eyes were burning. She was watching Julian. Julian leaned forward then. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light of the projector. He looked at me, his eyes dead and shark-like. He leaned in toward his microphone, but he didn't speak into it. He turned his head just enough so his voice would carry to me, to the judge, to the front row of the gallery. "Gold digger," he whispered. The words were soft, sibilant, and distinct. Gold digger. It was the ultimate insult. I was the one who ate ramen. I was the one who sold my grandmother's ring to pay for our first server rack. I was the one who wrote the compression algorithm that made VanceTech possible. And he was calling me a gold digger for trying to claim my share of what I built. The gallery murmured. I could feel the eyes of the strangers behind me drilling into my back. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? The photos were right there. The bank statements were in black and white. The judge narrowed her eyes at me. It was a look of pure disdain. In that look I saw my future evaporating. I saw the settlement being revoked. I saw myself walking out of this courtroom with nothing but the clothes on my back and a reputation so destroyed I'd never work in this town again. "Ms. Vance," the judge said, her voice icy, "do you have any documentation to refute these expenses? Or were you indeed treating the company account as your personal piggy bank?" I opened my mouth but no sound came out. My throat was closed tight with panic. I looked at my court-appointed lawyer. He was pale, shuffling papers, clearly looking for an exit strategy. He didn't have the documentation. Julian had locked me out of the cloud. All the receipts, all the emails, all the proof. It was on servers I couldn't access. I was trapped. I was drowning in a sea of fabricated evidence. And the water was rising fast. Julian smirked. He checked his watch again. He thought he had won. He thought the old lady in the back was just a spectator to his victory lap. He had no idea that the woman sitting in the back row wasn't just watching. She was taking notes. And she was about to teach him that while he might know how to code, she knew how to kill. Sterling stepped back, looking satisfied with the damage he had inflicted with the slideshow, and swept his hand toward the defense table. "The defense calls Mr. Julian Vance to the stand." I watched my husband rise from his chair. He didn't move with the arrogance he displayed in the boardroom or the swagger he used when he was closing a deal. No, today he moved with the heavy, reluctant gait of a martyr. He buttoned his jacket slowly, keeping his eyes on the floor, acting like a man who was about to do the hardest thing in the world. He was performing, and he was brilliant at it. As he walked past me, I smelled his aftershave, sandalwood and ambition. It was the same scent I had smelled on his collar the night I found out about his mistress. I felt the bile rise in the back of my throat. Julian took the oath, his hand resting on the Bible, his voice steady and grave. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes. "Mr. Vance," Sterling began, his voice soft, almost gentle, "we've seen the financial irregularities. We've seen the spending. But the court needs to understand the context. Why did you tolerate this behavior for so long? Why did you keep Mrs. Vance on the board?" Julian let out a long, shuddering sigh. He rubbed his face with his hands, a gesture of exhaustion that I knew he had practiced in the mirror. "Because I loved her," Julian said quietly. "And because she is sick." My head snapped up. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. "Sick?" Sterling prompted. "Can you elaborate?" "Octavia has struggles," Julian said, lowering his voice as if sharing a shameful family secret. Mental instability, paranoia, manic episodes. For the first 5 years of the company, I wasn't just the CEO. I was her caretaker. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room suddenly felt very cold. Objection! My lawyer squeaked, half standing. This is hearsay and irrelevant. It goes to the heart of her competence and her claim to the intellectual property, Your Honor, Sterling countered smoothly. Overruled, the judge said. Proceed. Julian looked at me then. For a second, just a split second, the mask slipped, and I saw the glint of triumph in his eyes. Then the mask was back, the sad, burdened husband. She claims she wrote the compression algorithm, Julian continued, turning back to the judge. But the truth is, during that time, Octavia was barely lucid. She would stay up for days, typing gibberish into the terminal. I would have to go in after she fell asleep, delete her manic ramblings, and write the actual code myself. I let her believe she was helping because the doctor said it was important for her self-esteem. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. My mouth fell open. I couldn't breathe. I remembered those nights. I remembered the Red Bull cans lined up on the desk. I remembered the cramping in my fingers. I remembered Julian asleep on the couch behind me while I debugged his sloppy code. I wrote that algorithm. I dreamt in Python. I bled for that code. And now, he was turning my hard work into a symptom of insanity. And the money? Sterling asked. The cash withdrawals. Julian looked down at his hands. I tried to hide it. I didn't want anyone to know. Octavia has a gambling problem. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Gambling, Sterling repeated. Online poker. High-stakes virtual slots. Underground games. Julian lied, the falsehoods flowing out of him like oil. She would disappear for hours. She'd come back shaking, asking for access to the corporate accounts. She said she had a system. She said she could double our seed money. When I refused, she would steal it. Those cash withdrawals. They weren't for developers. They were to pay off bookies. Felt sick. Physically, violently sick. My stomach churned, twisting into a tight knot of panic. My palms were slick with sweat, slipping against the polished wood of the table. I whispered, but my voice was lost in the growing murmur behind me. I could hear them. The spectators. The journalists. Did you hear that? A woman whispered loudly behind my left shoulder. A gambling addict. That explains the shoes. Sad, a man muttered. He carried her all this time. She looks unstable, doesn't she? Look at her shaking. I was shaking, but not from withdrawal. I was shaking from the sheer, visceral shock of being dissected alive. He wasn't just taking my money. He was taking my mind. He was rewriting my history until I was nothing but a cautionary tale, a millstone he had heroically dragged up the mountain of success. I tried to get her help, Julian said, his voice cracking with fake emotion. I paid for therapists. I covered her debts. I kept her name on the company paperwork because I didn't want to humiliate her. But she was never a partner, Your Honor. She was a liability. A liability I loved, yes. But a liability I can no longer afford. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. The judge looked at me. Her expression had shifted from disdain to pity, which was infinitely worse. She didn't see a greedy ex-wife anymore. She saw a broken, crazy woman who needed to be managed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thump, thump, thump. It was so loud I was sure the stenographer could hear it. I felt light-headed. The edges of my vision started to blur. I looked at my lawyer. He was staring at his notepad, refusing to meet my eyes. He believed him. Even my own advocate believed him. Julian was that good. Desperation clawed at my throat. I wanted to stand up and scream the truth. I wanted to shout about the nights I held Julian while he cried from stress. I wanted to scream about the code commits that were timestamped with my user ID. But he had wiped the logs. He had planned this for months. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone in a room full of people. I turned my head slowly, fighting the dizziness, and looked toward the back of the room. My mother was still there. She hadn't moved. She hadn't gasped at the mention of my insanity. She hadn't murmured when he called me a gambling addict. She sat perfectly still, her spine not touching the back of the bench. But as I looked at her, she did something small. She reached into her leather briefcase. She didn't look down. Her eyes stayed locked on Julian's face as he soaked up the sympathy of the court. Her hand disappeared into the bag and pulled out a single, thick manila folder. It looked old. The edges were frayed. She set it on her lap. She smoothed the cover with one hand. And then she winked at me. It was so quick I almost missed it. A tiny flicker of an eyelid. But in that fraction of a second, the crushing weight on my chest lifted just an inch. Julian finished his testimony. "I just want her to get help," he concluded softly. "I don't want to hurt her. But I have to protect the company." "Thank you, Mr. Vance," the judge said gently. "You may step down." Julian rose, looking appropriately drained. He walked back to his table, keeping his head down, playing the part of the grieving saint to the very end. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with a smug grin. "Your Honor, the defense rests." The judge nodded. She turned her gaze to my terrified lawyer. "Does the plaintiff have any witnesses to call? Or shall we move to closing arguments?" My lawyer started to stand up to say no. I knew he was going to fold. He was going to try to mitigate the damages and get me out of there before I embarrassed myself further. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the room. It wasn't loud, but it had the timbre of a steel cable snapping under tension. It was a voice that commanded absolute silence. "The plaintiff calls Eleanor Vance." My lawyer froze. The judge frowned. Julian stopped midway to his seat and turned around, his brow furrowing in confusion. My mother stood up. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for the bailiff. She simply picked up her cane, tucked the manila folder under her arm, and began to walk down the center aisle. The sound of her heels was the only sound in the world. Asterisk click, 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 asterisk. She walked past the murmuring crowd. She walked past the stunned journalists. She walked past me, and as she did, she trailed her fingers lightly across my shoulder, a touch that felt like an infusion of iron. She walked straight to the witness stand, bypassed the gate, and turned to face the courtroom. "I believe," my mother said, looking directly at Sterling, "you have some questions about my daughter's mental state. And I believe I have the documentation to answer them." She dropped the heavy folder onto the witness stand. It landed with a sound like a gunshot. "I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and despite being the true architect of a multimillion-dollar tech empire, I was currently sitting in a courtroom watching my husband dismantle my sanity for sport." The echo of my mother's heavy folder hitting the witness stand still hung in the air, a singular note of defiance in a room suffocated by lies. The entire courtroom was frozen. My mother, Eleanor, stood there like a statue carved from granite, her eyes boring into Julian. But Sterling, Julian's shark of a lawyer, wasn't about to let the momentum shift. He saw the danger my mother posed. He needed to bury me, and he needed to do it right now before she could open her mouth. "Your Honor," Sterling barked, his smooth demeanor fracturing just enough to show the panic underneath. "This is highly irregular. Before we entertain this ambush witness, the defense must present one final, critical piece of evidence. It is imperative to the court's understanding of the plaintiff's violent volatility." The judge frowned, looking between my stoic mother and the desperate lawyer. "Mr. Sterling, you rested your case." "Rebuttal evidence, Your Honor," Sterling insisted, sweat beading on his upper lip. "It goes directly to the safety of my client. It is less than 30 seconds. The judge sighed, rubbing her temples. "Proceed. But make it quick." Sterling nodded to his assistant, who tapped a key on the laptop connected to the courtroom speaker system. Static crackled through the room. And then a sound tore through the air that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a scream. Not just a scream, a guttural, animalistic shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. I want it dead. I want it all gone. Do you hear me? Burn it. Just burn it all down. My voice. Distorted, shrill, and terrifyingly loud, bouncing off the mahogany walls. The courtroom gasped. I saw the judge recoil physically, her eyes widening. I hate you. Get out. Get out or I'll kill you. The recording continued, the audio spiking with the sound of something shattering. Glass, maybe a vase, smashing against a wall. I stopped breathing. My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to claw its way out. I knew that scream. I knew that moment. It was 3 years ago. The night after my father's funeral. I had come home to find that Julian had thrown away my father's old moth-eaten armchair, the one he used to read to me in, because it clashed with the aesthetic of our new penthouse. It had broken. The grief I had been holding back for weeks, the sheer exhaustion of the funeral, the cruelty of Julian erasing the last physical trace of my dad, it all exploded. I had collapsed on the floor, wailing, screaming at the unfairness of death, screaming at the universe to burn down because a world without my father didn't feel worth living in. But the recording didn't show the grief. It didn't show me curling into a ball on the floor, sobbing until I threw up. It didn't hear Julian's voice, which had been calm and mocking that night, saying, "It's just a chair, Octavia, grow up." He had edited it. He had stripped out his own voice. He had cut out the jagged, wet sounds of my weeping. He had stitched together only the moments of peak volume, the seconds where my pain sounded like aggression. He had turned the worst night of my life into a weapon. "Stop it," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "Please stop it." Sterling let it play for 5 more agonizing seconds before cutting the feed. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. "As you can hear, Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a grave, concerned whisper. "This is not the voice of a rational business partner. This is the voice of a woman capable of violence. A woman my client has lived in fear of for years." I looked at Julian. He was looking down at the table, shaking his head slowly, the picture of a battered spouse. But I saw his hand resting on his knee. His index finger was tapping a rhythm. Tap. Tap. He was celebrating. My stomach churned violently. I felt stripped naked, flayed open for strangers to judge. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until my ribs felt like they were cracking. I looked at the faces in the gallery. Disgust, fear, pity. They believed him. They thought I was a monster. I had lost. The thought crashed over me like a tidal wave. I was going to lose the company I built from nothing. I was going to lose my reputation. I was going to be branded a lunatic in public record. I slumped in my chair, the fight draining out of me. I couldn't look at the judge. I couldn't look at Julian. I forced my eyes toward the witness stand, expecting to see my mother faltering. Expecting to see her putting the folder back in her bag, realizing her daughter was too damaged to save. But Eleanor Vance hadn't flinched. She stood there, her hand resting on the weathered manila folder, her expression unreadable. She waited until the echo of my screaming voice had fully faded. She waited until Sterling sat down, looking smug. Then she leaned into the microphone. "Are you quite finished playing with your tape recorder, Mr. Sterling?" she asked. Her voice was cool, crisp, and devoid of fear. "Because I believe the court is waiting for the truth." I barely heard my mother's retort. The sound of my own distorted scream was still ringing in my ears, drowning out her bravery, and I felt a desperate, clawing need to find an anchor in this sea of hostility. I turned my head toward the gallery benches behind me, searching for just one pair of eyes that held empathy instead of disgust. What I saw shattered the last fragments of my heart. The benches on Julian's side were packed. I saw Marcus, the CFO I had hired straight out of college, whispering to Julian's PR manager with a conspiratorial smirk. I saw Sarah, my maid of honor, staring studiously at her lap, refusing to meet my gaze. She was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet I knew she couldn't afford, a bracelet that looked suspiciously like the lavish thank you gifts Julian sent to high-value clients. I looked to my side of the aisle. Me. There was no one. Not a single friend. Not a single colleague. The 3 rows behind me were a barren wasteland of polished wood. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the gut. Julian hadn't just beaten me in court. He had systematically bought, charmed, or threatened everyone we knew. He had paid off our mutual friends with promotions, gifts, or silence, leaving me completely alone on an island of shame. I was a pariah in the kingdom I had built. I turned back to the front, my vision tunneling. The judge was shuffling her papers, her face set in a grim line that spelled disaster. She wasn't looking at my mother. She was looking at the asset division file. I could see the calculation happening in her eyes. She was going to strip me of everything. The house, the stocks, the patents. It was all going to go to the stable partner. I would walk out of here not just broken, but buried under a mountain of legal debt I could never repay. A cold wave of despair washed over me, numbing my fingers and making my teeth chatter. I was going to die a pauper in a city where I once ruled. I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, founder of the Vance Tech Unconglomerate, and I was currently gripping the edge of a mahogany table, praying that my mother could save me from the man who had sworn to love me forever. The silence following my mother's challenge to Sterling was absolute. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum that pressed against my eardrums. I watched Eleanor standing at the witness stand, her posture rigid, her tailored black suit looking like armor against the barrage of legal attacks. Sterling let out a dry, condescending chuckle, adjusting his silk tie. "Mrs. Vance, while I admire your maternal instinct, this is a court of law, not a family therapy session. The evidence speaks for itself. Your daughter is unstable." "The evidence speaks," my mother interrupted, her voice cutting through his smog of arrogance like a laser, "only when it hasn't been gagged and bound by a liar." A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery. The judge leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Watch your tone, witness. But if you have something relevant to the recording we just heard, produce it now." Eleanor didn't look at the judge. She looked straight at Julian. For the first time since the trial began, Julian stopped tapping his finger. His eyes locked onto the manila folder under my mother's hand. I saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Not fear, not yet, but calculation. He was wondering what she had. He was wondering if she was bluffing. "My daughter," Eleanor began, opening the folder with deliberate slowness, "is a brilliant software engineer. She built a home automation system that is currently licensed to 3 Fortune 500 companies. Did you know that, Julian?" Julian remained silent, his jaw clenching. "You didn't," Eleanor answered for him. "You were too busy spending the profits to understand the product. If you had, you would have known that the audio system in your penthouse doesn't just record locally. It creates a mirrored backup on an encrypted off-site server. A server you don't have the password to." My breath hitched. I had forgotten. In the fog of my grief and the subsequent year of gaslighting, I had completely forgotten the redundancy protocol I coded into the alpha build of our home system. Sterling jumped up, sensing the shift in the tectonic plates of the trial. "Objection. Ambush evidence. We haven't had time to verify." "Overruled," the judge snapped, her eyes glued to my mother. "Proceed, Mrs. Vance." Eleanor pulled a small silver USB drive from the folder. It glittered under the courtroom lights like a weapon. Mr. Sterling played a 14-second clip. "I have the full 45 minutes of that night. Would the court like to hear the context of my daughter's scream?" The judge nodded. "Play it." My mother handed the drive to the bailiff. My hands were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together in my lap. I looked at Julian. The color was draining from his face, leaving him a pale, waxen shade of gray. He knew. He remembered what he had said that night. The static crackled again. Then the audio began. It didn't start with my scream. It started with Julian's laugh. "Look at you," Julian's voice sneered from the speakers, crystal clear and oozing with malice. Asterisk, crying over a piece of garbage. That chair smelled like old man and failure. I did you a favor. Asterisk. Then came the sound of my sobbing, raw and broken. Asterisk. It was his favorite chair, Julian. Why would you do that? Asterisk. Because I control this house, Octavia. The recording continued. Asterisk. I control what goes in it and I control you. Stop whining or I'll make sure you lose the rest of his junk too. Maybe I'll burn the photo albums next. Asterisk. Then came the scream. Asterisk. I want it dead. I want it all gone. Do you hear me? Burn it. Just burn it all down. Asterisk. But this time the context transformed the words. I wasn't screaming about the house or my life. I was screaming about the pain. I was screaming in a desperate, hyperbolic plea to stop the emotional torture. The recording played on. That's it, Julian's voice said, sounding bored. Asterisk, keep screaming. I'm recording this, by the way. You have no idea how easy it's going to be to convince a judge you're crazy when I edit this later. Asterisk. The courtroom erupted. It wasn't a murmur this time. It was a roar. Journalists were frantically typing. The gallery was gasping. I saw the judge's face harden into a mask of pure fury. She looked from the speaker to Julian, her eyes narrowing into slits. Turn it off, the judge commanded, her voice icy. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of my humiliation. It was the silence of a predator being cornered. I looked at the gallery behind me. I saw the shock on the faces of the people who had abandoned me. I saw Julian's PR manager frantically whispering into his phone, likely trying to kill a story that was already dead in the water. But I didn't care about them. I looked at Julian. He wasn't tapping his finger anymore. He was gripping the table, his knuckles white, staring at the USB drive as if he could melt it with his hate. He looked small. He looked pathetic. The monster that had haunted my nightmares for 3 years was dissolving in the light of the truth. My mother leaned into the microphone again. She wasn't done. "I also have the bank records," she said, pulling a stack of papers from the folder. "Mr. Sterling claimed my daughter was financially irresponsible. These documents show transfers from the joint account to an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary is listed as Sterling and Associates Consulting." She looked at the lawyer, dropping the paper onto the stand. "I believe that's you, Mr. Sterling." Sterling froze. His mouth opened but no sound came out. He looked at the judge, then at Julian, then at the door, realizing there was no escape. A rush of adrenaline surged through my veins, hot and electric. My vision cleared. The weight on my chest vanished. I stood up. I didn't ask for permission. I just stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor," I said, my voice trembling not with fear, but with the release of 1,000 days of silence. "I would like to move for an immediate dismissal of the plaintiff's claims. And I would like to file a counter-motion for fraud, embezzlement, and spousal abuse." The judge looked at me. For the first time, she didn't see a crazy woman. She saw a CEO. She saw a survivor. "Motion heard," the judge said, picking up her gavel. She looked at Sterling, who was now sweating profusely. "And Mr. Sterling, you'd better call your own lawyer. You're going to need one." The gavel came down. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I turned to my mother. She stepped down from the stand and walked toward me. She didn't smile. Eleanor Vance didn't do smiles in public, but her eyes were shining. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it hard. "Come on, Octavia," she said, loud enough for Julian to hear. "We have a company to run." I looked back at Julian one last time. He was slumped in his chair, head in his hands, alone on his side of the aisle. The friends he had bought were already slipping out the back doors, distancing themselves from the sinking ship. I turned my back on him. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking in rhythm with my mother's, walking out of the courtroom and back into my life. I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and I thought the war was over, but my husband had one last grenade to throw. We hadn't even reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom when Julian's voice cracked through the air, shrill and desperate. "You can't touch the interface," he screamed, scrambling up from his slumped position like a cornered rat. "The prenup protects my intellectual property. The outcome of this trial doesn't matter for the business structure. I still own 51% of the voting stock." The bailiff moved to intercept him, but Julian was manic. His eyes wild, darting between the judge and my retreating back. "Did you hear me, Octavia? You get the house, you get the tears, but I keep the empire. I am the majority shareholder." Froze. My hand hovered over the brass handle of the courtroom door. A cold pit opened in my stomach because, technically, he was right. The abuse proved grounds for divorce, and the fraud proved he was a criminal. But the corporate bylaws were a separate, ironclad beast. If he kept the company, he would still have the power, the platform, and the money to torment me for decades. He would burn my legacy to the ground just to warm his hands. I felt my mother's hand leave mine. I turned around. Eleanor wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Julian with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't disgust. It was the look of a grandmaster watching a novice move a pawn into a fatal trap. "Wait," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a calm authority that made the bailiff pause in his tracks. She didn't walk back down the center aisle. She cut to the side, bypassing the pews with a stride that was terrifyingly purposeful. I watched in shock as my mother walked straight to the evidence table, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the sharp click of her heels against the parquet floor. Julian sneered, wiping sweat from his upper lip. His arrogance trying to reassemble itself. "What are you doing, Eleanor?" "Trying to bribe the stenographer." "It's over. The bylaws are public record. The primary investor is Archangel Holdings." "That's me. I secured that funding." "You secured funding," my mother said, reaching into her oversized tote bag. "From a blind trust." "So what?" Julian barked, his confidence flickering but still burning. "They gave me the capital. I retain control. They are silent partners." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, old school, tattered at the edges, looking completely out of place among the sleek laptops and tablets on the legal bench. She placed it in front of the judge with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice cool and crisp. "I apologize for the theatrics, but given the defendant's outburst regarding asset distribution and company ownership, this is pertinent." The judge, who looked like she was ready to retire for the day, peered over her glasses, intrigued. "What is this, Mrs. Vance?" "This," Eleanor said, placing her manicured hand flat on the leather cover, "is the incorporation ledger for Archangel Holdings." I saw the color drain from Julian's face. It happened in slow motion. The arrogance, the sneer, the manic energy, it all evaporated, leaving behind the pale, hollow shell of a man who realizes he has stepped off a cliff. "No," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "That's impossible." "Julian always bragged about his silent partner," my mother continued, turning her gaze to him, her eyes hard as flint. "He said this angel investor believed in his vision so much they gave him carte blanche. He never questioned why the term sheets were so favorable. He never questioned why the board meetings were always done via proxy." She opened the ledger, flipping to the final page where a single signature was inked in blue. "I am Archangel Holdings," she announced, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "I'm not just Octavia's mother. I am the silent investor who owns 51% of Julian's company. I own his patents. I own his brand. I own the chair he is sitting in." My knees nearly buckled. I grabbed the back of the nearest pew to steady myself, my breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. For 5 years, Julian had strutted around like a king, belittling me, telling me I didn't understand big business, all while unknowingly answering to my mother. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her mouth slightly open. "That's a lie," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into a sob. "You're a retired florist. You don't have that kind of capital." "I retired from floristry," Eleanor corrected him, her eyes glittering with a terrifying intelligence, "after I sold my logistical software to the Department of Defense in 1998. Octavia gets her coding skills from me, you idiot." She turned back to the judge. "As the majority shareholder, I am invoking the bad actor clause in our bylaws. Effective immediately, Julian Sterling is removed as CEO for gross misconduct. He is stripped of his salary. His stock options are liquidated to pay for the damages to my daughter, and he is barred from the premises of any Vance Tech subsidiary." She looked at Julian, her lips curving into a smile that was sharp enough to cut glass. "You don't keep the empire, Julian. You're fired." The sound that came out of Julian wasn't a word. It was a strangled, animalistic whimper. He collapsed back into his chair, sliding down until he was almost under the table, burying his face in his hands. His lawyer, the other Mr. Sterling, was already packing his briefcase with frantic speed, refusing to make eye contact with his client. I stared at my mother. She stood there in her tailored suit, the architect of my salvation, the secret titan who had been waiting in the shadows for the exact right moment to strike. She looked across the room at me and gave a single, subtle nod. The judge cleared her throat, a small smile playing on her lips as she looked down at the defeated man. "Well," she said, picking up her gavel again, "it seems the assets have been definitively divided. Court is adjourned." This time, when the gavel banged, it sounded like a victory drum. I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and just when I thought I had witnessed the absolute peak of my husband's destruction, I realized my mother had brought a second executioner to the courtroom. The silence that followed Eleanor's revelation, that she was the archangel who owned Julian's entire existence, was thick enough to choke on. Julian was still slumped under the table, a pitiful heap of designer wool and shattered ego, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the dock. I looked at my mother, expecting her to gloat, expecting her to bask in the victory of firing him from the company he thought was his kingdom. But Eleanor didn't gloat. She simply checked her watch, a sharp, mechanical gesture that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "While the corporate restructuring is handled, there remains the matter of the criminal evidence presented against my daughter earlier in this trial. I call my associate Beatrice Thorne to the stand." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. A woman walked in who looked like she was made of steel wire and mathematics. She wore a charcoal suit that was all sharp angles, her gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes. She carried a metallic briefcase handcuffed to her wrist. I blinked, confused. I had never seen this woman before in my life. Julian lifted his head from his hands, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He squinted at the woman walking down the aisle, and for a second, I saw a flicker of recognition in his panic. "Who is that?" I whispered to my mother as she stepped back to the defense table. "That," Eleanor whispered back, her eyes fixed on Julian, "is the woman who has been living inside Julian's hard drive for the last 3 years." Beatrice Thorne took the stand with the efficiency of a machine. She didn't look at the jury. She didn't look at me. She set her briefcase on the ledge, unlocked the handcuffs with a small key, and produced a laptop that looked military-grade. "I am a forensic digital analyst specializing in corporate fraud and audio manipulation," Beatrice stated, her voice dry and raspy. "I was retained by Archangel Holdings 36 months ago to monitor internal communications and asset flow regarding the defendant, Julian Sterling." Julian let out a strangled noise. You were the IT consultant. You fixed the server in 2021. Beatrice didn't even glance at him. She plugged her laptop into the court's projector system. A massive waveform appeared on the screen behind the judge, a visual representation of sound. "Exhibit A," Beatrice said. "Earlier today, Mr. Sterling played an audio recording for this court. In that recording, Mrs. Octavia Vance is heard screaming threats, appearing mentally unstable and violent. It was the linchpin of his argument for full custody and the restraining order." I felt my stomach tighten. Hearing that tape earlier had almost broken me. Sounded so real. Sounded like I was a monster. "That audio," Beatrice continued, tapping a key, "was a composite. A deep fake edit using snippets of arguments spanning 5 years, spliced together and layered over a silence track." She pressed a button. The courtroom speakers crackled. Asterisk original audio playing asterisk. "Please, Julian, just stop," my voice sobbed. It was me, but I sounded scared, not angry. Then, a voice that had been scrubbed from the version Julian played cut through the air. It was Julian's voice. Low, menacing, cold. If you leave this room, Octavia, I'll tell the police you hit me. I'll ruin your reputation. I'll make sure you never see a dime. Scream all you want. No one is listening. Then came my scream, the scream he had used to paint me as the aggressor. But in context, it wasn't a scream of rage. It was a scream of terror. The entire courtroom recoiled. The stenographer stopped typing, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of validation. For years he had gaslighted me, told me I misremembered things, told me I was the crazy one. Hearing the truth play out in high definition was like having a lobotomy reversed. He edited himself out, Beatrice said simply. He removed his provocations and rearranged her reactions to fit a narrative of hysteria. It is a textbook fabrication. Julian was shaking his head violently. No, that's fake. She faked that. I have the metadata timestamps from the original cloud upload on your private server, Mr. Sterling, Beatrice said, her tone boring. You deleted the files, but you didn't wipe the shadow cache. Amateurs rarely do. She didn't stop there. She closed the audio file and opened a spreadsheet that looked like a spiderweb of red lines. Exhibit B, she announced. The embezzlement. The screen shifted. It showed a complex flow of money, millions of dollars, moving from Vance Tech accounts into a shell company called Blue Heron LLC. Mr. Sterling claimed my daughter was draining company funds to fuel a gambling addiction. Eleanor interjected from beside me, her voice cutting like a knife. He presented bank statements with Octavia's digital signature. The signature was forged, Beatrice said, highlighting a column of code. Mr. Sterling used a keystroke logger to capture Mrs. Vance's passwords. He then accessed the accounts from a distinct IP address located at a luxury apartment in the city, an apartment leased under the name of his mistress. The heir left the room. I stared at the screen. The dates aligned perfectly with the nights Julian told me he was working late to fix my mistakes. He wasn't fixing my mistakes. He was stealing our future, framing me for the theft, and spending the money on a double life. We have tracked $4.2 million, Beatrice recited, scrolling through the damning list of transactions. He was funneling the money out, intending to leave Mrs. Vance with the debt and the criminal liability once the divorce was finalized. He was building a golden parachute woven out of his wife's reputation. I looked at Julian. He wasn't shaking his head anymore. He was frozen, his mouth slightly agape, staring at the screen that displayed the mathematical proof of his soul's rot. He looked at Beatrice, then at Eleanor. You watched me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You knew. For 3 years. Eleanor stepped forward, moving in front of me like a shield. We didn't just watch, Julian. We waited. We let you dig the hole deep enough so that when you finally fell in, you would never ever climb back out. Beatrice closed her laptop with a final snap. The forensic evidence has been submitted to the district attorney, Your Honor, along with the unedited audio files. The judge looked at Julian. Her expression had shifted from professional neutrality to profound disdain. She looked at the bailiff. Bailiff, the judge said, her voice echoing with authority. Secure the doors. No one leaves. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see my mother looking down at me, her eyes fierce and protective. I told you I'd handle it, she said softly. I looked back at the man I had married, the man who had promised to love and cherish me. He was currently trying to crawl under the defense table to hide from the bailiff, who was unhooking a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The war wasn't just over. The enemy had been obliterated. I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and after enduring 3 years of psychological torture and a trial designed to strip me of my dignity, I was finally watching the gavel of justice swing back like a wrecking ball. The air in the courtroom had turned so heavy it felt like the oxygen was being siphoned out. Beatrice Thorne's laptop screen was still glowing behind the judge's bench, displaying the damning red web of Julian's embezzlement, but my eyes were glued to the judge. Judge Holloway was a woman known for her stoicism, a terrifyingly neutral figure who had watched me cry on the stand earlier that morning without so much as a blink. But now that neutrality was fracturing. I saw the blood rush up her neck, staining her skin a deep, violent crimson that clashed with her black robes. Her jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle twitching beneath her cheek. She wasn't just angry. She was insulted. Julian had come into her house, sat in her chair, and lied to her face with a confidence reserved for sociopaths. He hadn't just committed a crime. He had made her an accessory to his abuse. The silence was shattered by a sharp, metallic click. I flinched, turning my head. It was Julian's lawyer, Mr. Crest. He wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at the jury. He was staring down at his mahogany table, methodically closing his leather binder. He clicked his expensive pen shut and slid it into his breast pocket. Then he began to pack his briefcase. Julian, whose face was currently the color of wet ash, grabbed his lawyer's arm. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Object. Tell them it's a lie. Do something." Mr. Crest pulled his arm away as if Julian's touch was contagious. He didn't even whisper. He spoke at a normal volume, his voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. "I cannot suborn perjury, Mr. Sterling," Crest said, snapping the latches of his briefcase. "And I will not be disbarred for a client who falsifies evidence. You are on your own." I felt a shiver race down my spine. Even the shark was fleeing the water. "Mr. Crest," Judge Holloway boomed. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it possessed a terrifying resonance that made the court reporter jump. "You will remain seated until I dismiss you. No one is going anywhere." She turned her gaze on Julian. I had seen Julian look at me with contempt 1,000 times. I had seen him look at me with pity, with mock concern, with rage. But I had never seen him look like this. He was small. He was shrinking into his custom-tailored suit, his shoulders hunching as the judge's eyes bore into him. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen desperation. I have seen greed. But I have rarely seen such a calculated, malicious attempt to weaponize this court against a victim." "Your Honor, Julian started, half rising from his chair. "Sit down," she roared. Julian collapsed back into his seat as if he'd been shot. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and exhilaration. I gripped the edge of my table, my knuckles turning white. "The evidence presented by the defense is not merely exculpatory," Judge Holloway continued, leaning over the bench. "It is evidence of multiple felonies committed within my jurisdiction. Perjury, falsification of evidence, fraud upon the court." She grabbed a pen and began writing furiously on a docket sheet, the scratching sound amplifying in the microphone. "I am hereby issuing an immediate freezing order on all assets held by Julian Sterling, including the shell entity, Blue Heron LLC, and any offshore holdings identified in Ms. Thorne's report. You will not access a single dime, Mr. Sterling. You will not transfer a single cent." She looked up, her eyes flashing. "Furthermore, I am vacating the temporary restraining order against Mrs. Vance with prejudice." It is null and void. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, a sob catching in my throat. The chain around my neck was gone. "Bailiff!" the judge barked. The bailiff, a burly man who had spent the morning looking bored near the exit, stepped forward. He unhooked the handcuffs from his belt. The metal jingled, a sound that used to terrify me but now sounded like music. "Take Mr. Sterling into custody," the judge ordered. "I am holding him in direct contempt of court, pending charges from the district attorney's office regarding the embezzlement and wire fraud." "You can't do this," Julian screamed, finally snapping. He scrambled backward, knocking his chair over with a loud clatter. "I'm Julian Sterling. I own this city. You can't touch me." I watched, paralyzed, as the facade of the powerful CEO completely disintegrated. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a scared, pathetic man flailing against consequences he thought he was above. The bailiff didn't hesitate. He grabbed Julian by the shoulder and spun him around. "Hands behind your back," the bailiff commanded. "Octavia!" Julian yelled, his eyes locking onto mine, wild and desperate. "Octavia, tell them. Tell them it's a mistake. We can work this out. Baby, please." He called me baby. After trying to frame me. After stealing millions. After trying to take my children. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but my spine was steel. I looked him dead in the eye. "I don't know who you are," I said, my voice quiet but steady enough to carry across the room. "My husband died a long time ago." The handcuffs ratcheted shut. Asterisk click. Click. Asterisk. The sound echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute. Julian was hauled toward the side door, still sputtering threats and pleas that no one was listening to. As the heavy door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his voice, a profound silence settled over the room. I sank back into my chair, my entire body trembling. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the adrenaline crash of a soldier who had just survived a mortar strike. I felt a warm hand cover mine. I looked up to see my mother, Eleanor. She wasn't smiling. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. She squeezed my hand, her grip firm and grounding. "It's done, Octavia," she whispered. "He can't hurt you anymore." I looked toward the judge, who was now calmly organizing her papers, her crimson face fading back to a professional pallor. She looked up and caught my eye. For a brief second, the mask slipped, and she gave me a nod, a human acknowledgement of the hell I had just walked out of. "Court is adjourned," she said. The gavel banged one last time. I closed my eyes and finally, for the first time in 3 years, I inhaled without feeling the weight of his boot on my chest. "I'm Octavia Vance, 34 years old, and after enduring 3 years of psychological torture and a trial designed to strip me of my dignity, I was finally watching the gavel of justice swing back like a wrecking ball. The air in the courtroom had turned so heavy it felt like the oxygen was being siphoned out. Beatrice Thorne's laptop screen was still glowing behind the judge's bench, displaying the damning red web of Julian's embezzlement, but my eyes were glued to the judge. Judge Holloway was a woman known for her stoicism, a terrifyingly neutral figure who had watched me cry on the stand earlier that morning without so much as a blink. But now that neutrality was fracturing. I saw the blood rush up her neck, staining her skin a deep, violent crimson that clashed with her black robes. Her jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle twitching beneath her cheek. She wasn't just angry. She was insulted. Julian had come into her house, sat in her chair, and lied to her face with a confidence reserved for sociopaths. He hadn't just committed a crime. He had made her an accessory to his abuse. The silence was shattered by a sharp, metallic click. I flinched, turning my head. It was Julian's lawyer, Mr. Crest. He wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at the jury. He was staring down at his mahogany table, methodically closing his leather binder. He clicked his expensive pen shut and slid it into his breast pocket. Then he began to pack his briefcase. Julian, whose face was currently the color of wet ash, grabbed his lawyer's arm. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Object. Tell them it's a lie. Do something." Mr. Crest pulled his arm away as if Julian's touch was contagious. He didn't even whisper. He spoke at a normal volume, his voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. "I cannot suborn perjury, Mr. Sterling," Crest said, snapping the latches of his briefcase. "And I will not be disbarred for a client who falsifies evidence. You are on your own." I felt a shiver race down my spine. Even the shark was fleeing the water. "Mr. Crest," Judge Holloway boomed. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it possessed a terrifying resonance that made the court reporter jump. "You will remain seated until I dismiss you. No one is going anywhere." She turned her gaze on Julian. I had seen Julian look at me with contempt 1,000 times. I had seen him look at me with pity, with mock concern, with rage. But I had never seen him look like this. He was small. He was shrinking into his custom-tailored suit, his shoulders hunching as the judge's eyes bore into him. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen desperation. I have seen greed. But I have rarely seen such a calculated, malicious attempt to weaponize this court against a victim." "Your Honor, Julian started, half rising from his chair. "Sit down," she roared. Julian collapsed back into his seat as if he'd been shot. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and exhilaration. I gripped the edge of my table, my knuckles turning white. "The evidence presented by the defense is not merely exculpatory," Judge Holloway continued, leaning over the bench. "It is evidence of multiple felonies committed within my jurisdiction. Perjury, falsification of evidence, fraud upon the court." She grabbed a pen and began writing furiously on a docket sheet, the scratching sound amplifying in the microphone. "I am hereby issuing an immediate freezing order on all assets held by Julian Sterling, including the shell entity, Blue Heron LLC, and any offshore holdings identified in Ms. Thorne's report. You will not access a single dime, Mr. Sterling. You will not transfer a single cent." She looked up, her eyes flashing. "Furthermore, I am vacating the temporary restraining order against Mrs. Vance with prejudice. It is null and void." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, a sob catching in my throat. The chain around my neck was gone. "Bailiff," the judge barked. The bailiff, a burly man who had spent the morning looking bored near the exit, stepped forward. He unhooked the handcuffs from his belt. The metal jingled, a sound that used to terrify me but now sounded like music. "Take Mr. Sterling into custody," the judge ordered. "I am holding him in direct contempt of court, pending charges from the district attorney's office regarding the embezzlement and wire fraud." "You can't do this," Julian screamed, finally snapping. He scrambled backward, knocking his chair over with a loud clatter. "I'm Julian Sterling. I own this city. You can't touch me." I watched, paralyzed, as the facade of the powerful CEO completely disintegrated. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a scared, pathetic man flailing against consequences he thought he was above. The bailiff didn't hesitate. He grabbed Julian by the shoulder and spun him around. "Hands behind your back," the bailiff commanded. "Octavia!" Julian yelled, his eyes locking onto mine, wild and desperate. "Octavia, tell them. Tell them it's a mistake. We can work this out. Baby, please." He called me baby. After trying to frame me. After stealing millions. After trying to take my children. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but my spine was steel. I looked him dead in the eye. "I don't know who you are," I said, my voice quiet but steady enough to carry across the room. "My husband died a long time ago." The handcuffs ratcheted shut. Asterisk click. Click. Asterisk. The sound echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute. Julian was hauled toward the side door, still sputtering threats and pleas that no one was listening to. As the heavy door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his voice, a profound silence settled over the room. I sank back into my chair, my entire body trembling. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the adrenaline crash of a soldier who had just survived a mortar strike. I felt a warm hand cover mine. I looked up to see my mother, Eleanor. She wasn't smiling. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. She squeezed my hand, her grip firm and grounding. "It's done, Octavia," she whispered. "He can't hurt you anymore." I looked toward the judge, who was now calmly organizing her papers, her crimson face fading back to a professional pallor. She looked up and caught my eye. For a brief second, the mask slipped, and she gave me a nod, a human acknowledgement of the hell I had just walked out of. "Court is adjourned," she said. The gavel banged one last time. I stood up, my knees wobbling only slightly. My mother stood with me, linking her arm through mine. We turned away from the empty defense table, away from the chaos, and walked toward the double doors at the back of the room. The sunlight hitting the courthouse steps outside was blinding. It warmed my face instantly, chasing away the sterile chill of the courtroom. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs until they hurt. I realized then that while I had been mourning a marriage, weeping over lost love and broken promises, my mother had been preparing a war. She had sharpened her knives while I was still trying to bandage my wounds. I looked at her profile, at the strong set of her jaw and the gray hairs she wore like medals. "Thank you," I choked out. She patted my hand resting on her arm. "Let's go get your kids, Octavia." I stepped forward onto the pavement, and for the first time in years, I breathed the air of a woman who was finally truly free.